Good evening, everybody.
Kavod Harav, how are you?
Thank God, Baruch Hashem.
Oh, Hashem.
Okay. Okay. So here we find in the Torah, it says, "V'davar she'en b'mino b'mechubar." So what about something which, is not attached to the ground? And also not lacking any trapping. Im ba mitoch ha'tchum mutar lechol. Right. So now the question is, what about if the goy brings this for you? Are you allowed to use it? So forth and so on. So he says, right, that if he's coming from within the boundaries of the town, then it's allowed for anybody to use that. There's no prohibition here. So it says Bet Yosef, Hashut b'memra de Rapapa shkatabti. So it says, comes out from this Gemara that we saw with Rapapa. Im en me'oto hamin b'mechubar toch hatchum mutar. So he says like this, right? If you don't have from that type something which is attached, then it's allowed, as long as it came from within the boundaries of the town. Okay, so that's clear. So then he says, the Torah, if it came from, what about if it came from outside the boundary? So there, right, asur le'ochlan, you're not allowed to eat it, because it was brought for him. But others can eat it. So for that person that it was brought, he's not allowed to eat it, but others can. Okay. So it says regarding that, the Bet Yosef, Gam Zeh Sham, it's also there, B'memra de Papa, on the statement of Papa. Chutz letchum asur. So it says if it comes from outside the boundary, it's forbidden. Also, if it was bought from one Jew, it's allowed to be used by some other Jew. Rashi explains that Tama Mishum Dechevan de Isur Techumin de Rabbanan. So he says the reason is because since the prohibition of Tchumin, right? So what is Tchumin, by the way? There is a prohibition on Shabbat and Yom Tov called Tchumin. Anybody know what that is? So I'll explain to you, right? What it means is that you're not allowed to leave the town boundaries on that day. So he says, but since the prohibition of town boundaries is from the rabbis, the Rabbanan, lo achamur kulehai, so they were not so stringent about that. The da'im asru al zeh. So therefore, they only forbade it for the person that was brought for, but not for everybody else. So what that means is that on Yom Tov and Shabbat, you're not allowed to leave the boundaries of the town. So now let me give you a little bit of a quiz over here, right? To see what if you're with me or not. Are you allowed to walk from somebody who's been in New York, like from Brooklyn to Queens? Are you allowed to walk on Shabbat or Yom Tov?
I'm guessing if there's an Europe and you're not carrying any, I mean, if you have to carry your keys or something,
Right.
you have to have an Europe. So if
Right.
there's
So what about the issue of leaving the town boundaries?
it's to
What
that
about
you have to be able to see the town, and if you don't see it, then you cannot travel that far.
so the rule is like this, right? That walking from Brooklyn to Queens is allowed on Shabbat. So now let me ask you a question. Why is that? What's the reason why? Anybody know? So because it's really all one town. It's New York City, right? So you're not going to a different town. You're going to a different borough. But not only that, New York and Queens, right? There's no gap between them. You know what I mean? It's just like one straight, it's like a consecutive rows of houses going from one to another. So there's nothing, in between them. So therefore, because it's all one consecutive rows of houses and so forth and so on, it's considered to be one town, really, right? It's one city. So therefore, there's no prohibition to walk from Queens to Brooklyn. So yeah, it takes a long time. It's a long walk, but if you're up to it, right? There's no prohibition. So when does the prohibition of leaving your town apply? It applies where the housed part of the town is over basically, right? There's nothing there, and it's just like blank space, right? So there, you've already reached the end of the town. There's nothing. There's no more habitation there, right? So therefore, you're at the end. So after that, you have another 70 amot, which is like 35 meters, right? That's about it, and then you're done. So you can't leave that town boundary, right, on Shabbat, on Yom Tov. That's what we're talking about. But if it's one long, habitated area, there's no problem with that. So respectively, right, according to where you live, you have to know how that works, right? How that functions. But also, there's the issue of it's one town, So I'm not going to get into all the details now, right, about these rules. We would have to, study that a little bit. But anyway, right, that's the basic idea, of tchumin. So now he's telling you, right, that the here, depends on if the goy brought this item that he brought for you, your gift, right, whatever, right? Did he bring it from inside the boundary or outside the boundary? That's the question, right? If he brought it from Brooklyn to Queens, it's okay, right? No problem. It's all one city, right? So you got no problem with that. But if you brought it from a town, where really like the end is the end, right? There are more habitation. So there you got a problem. So yeah, there's all kinds of rules about that, how much space you have to have and so forth and so on. All kinds of issues, but anyway, right? That's basically the idea. So if it brings it from outside the town, right, which means that for you that's forbidden, right, to bring something from there, because you can't go there. It's very, very simple, right? Even on Yom Tov, that you don't need an eruv, right? We don't need an eruv on Yom Tov. But nevertheless, right, you have the prohibition of tchum, right, of boundaries. That's what he's saying. On Shabbat, there's also the issue of the eruv, as you said, right, to carry from one place to another. That's a different issue, right? That's a additional problem that comes with that. Okay, so pretty much that's what we're saying, right? But he says that since to leave your town boundaries is basically a rabbinical prohibition, so therefore the rabbis were not that stringent. So what does that mean? They weren't that stringent? That if the goy brought it for you from outside the boundary, so you can't use it, but your friends can use it. No problem. Okay, so let's go on. Katav Aran. So he brings here the Ran. The Divrei Arif, according to the Rif, he says the Ramban, shesovrim the tchum shalosh parsaot deoraita. Oh, so they hold, right, that depends on how far you leave the boundaries, right? Because if you go more than 3 parsaot, that's already like a big distance, So there, that's from the Torah already, the prohibition, That's a very different story. אפשר שהטעם שהקילו לתירו ישראל אחר, היינו משום דאיסור תחומין אינו שווה בכל שרד בכל. So he says, well, according to that opinion, then what do we say? Right? Why were they lenient to rabbis? So he says, because the prohibition is not equal to everybody, right? Of boundaries. שמהו שהוא לאחד חוץ מתחום, הוא לאחר תוך התחום, לפיכך הקילו בה, right? So therefore, he's saying, right, that since depends on the person, right? It's not equal for everybody. So therefore, the rabbis were lenient. They didn't go too stringent with you. So just to explain that a little bit better, what he means to say is like this, right? That the prohibition of boundaries only applies, according to where you live. So it's not equal to everybody because depending on your location, right? So therefore, since it's not equal to every person, the prohibition of boundaries, so therefore the rabbis were more lenient. That's what he's saying. Interesting. Okay. So then he goes on here. The Bikia Gavna.
Kavod Harav, I'm sorry, 3 parshiot, what's that, 2,000 amot?
Parsaot.
Parsaot.
Right.
What's
Parsa. So parsa is it's the amount of time that it's the distance that it takes to walk 72 minutes.
Thank you.
Called parsa. How much is that? It's about 2 miles. Something like that.
Thank you.
Give or take, right? Okay. So, good. Let's go on. So he says, בדעת, בקיע גבנה דהן במינו במחובר, ואינו מחוסר צדה, אלא שבא מחוץ לתחום מודה רביתון דמותר ביום טוב שני. So he says, in this case, right, that we discussed now, even Rabbeinu Tam is lenient, right? We already said in the other case, he was stringent when it was something which can be attached to the ground. But here, we're talking about something which is not attached to the realm. So therefore, even Rabbeinu Tam will allow you to use it on the second day of Yom Tov, right? Only the first day is going to be a problem. Because, as we said, right, regarding boundaries, the rabbis were lenient. That's what's in Tosfot Perek Bechol HaMe'arvin over there. Mem Amud Aleph. B'Shem Bahag. Name of the Bahag. V'kach katav Asmak. It says Samak. B'Shem Rabbeinu Yechiel. So there are several rabbis, right, who have written this, that here even Rabbeinu Tam would be lenient. Okay. Right. והמורדכי כתב בפרק בכל מערבין, לאותו ישראל שהובאו בשבילו אסור. So he says, right, the Mordechai, that for that Jew, that it was brought for him, it's forbidden, at Kadesh Yasub. He says you also have to wait the time that it takes to do the labor. After Yom Tov goes out. So he says, because since he brought them for the Jew, Zev Bishvil Israel, right? So then we're concerned that maybe he's going to tell the Goy, Lech ve'aveh bishvil Yom Tov Sheni. He's going to tell him, go and bring me something for the second day of Yom Tov. Right? Okay. Esharinan le b'sheni. We're going to allow him to do that on the second day. Okay, interesting. So let's go on. But it says when it comes to a different Jew, right, another Jew, that they weren't bought for him, these items. Gam b'yom tov rishon mutar. Oh, so for him, even on the first day of Yom Tov, it's allowed to use this thing. That's the end of it, right? So we already pretty much said that, right? To whatever he said here. So it's like repetitive. But anyway, the Gamma Kolbo says also Kolbo Katab B'Shem Arif. He says in the name of the Arif. Yeah. So the truth is, that it doesn't say the Rif over here. It says the Raf, right? So that could be Rabbeinu Peretz, whatever it is anyway, right? So Leoto She'uv'u B'Shvilo. So it says for that person that they were bought for him, Asurin Ad Moshe Yom Tov Sheni. They're forbidden, he says, until the second night it goes out. In other words, the second day of Yom Tov finishes. The Chevan She'uv'u B'Shvil Israel says because since they were bought for a Jew, Kelamecha Shimei Yomar Legoy. So we're concerned that maybe he'll tell to the Goy, Lech ve'aveh li b'shvil Yom Tov Yom Sheni. Go and bring me for the second day. If we allow him to do that, b'sheni in the second day. Mio, he says, Achar kach katab b'shem Araf. So then he writes in the name of the Raf, whatever. Gam ken kimdumeli sheitir Rabbeinu Yechiel. So it seems to me that Rabbeinu Yechiel allowed this b'shnei yamim tovim shel galuyot regarding the 2 days of the diaspora to Yom Tov. For instance, let's say there was some cheese, right, that was brought from outside the boundary, Leoto Israel, right, to that Jew, and it was brought for him, right? It's interesting that he, uses the example of cheese, because the truth is, right, we're not allowed to eat the cheese of Goyim. So I guess he must be talking about kosher cheese. Whatever it is. Okay. So anyway, it goes on. So what's halacha? Bottom line, right? So it says, right, again, he brings here 2 rabbis, right? Tosfot and Rabbeinu Yechiel. And he says they're gdolim, right? Big rabbis with big shoulders, right? And they're lenient, and it's also rabbinical. So therefore, right, why not? Let's go for it. Let's be lenient. So, Katav Rashba B'tshuva, says the Rashba, the davar she'en b'imuna mechubar, uvu michutz tchum, mutar lemי שלא הובא בשבילו, hanamile beperot goy. So he says, what we just said, this halacha, right? When does it apply? When the fruits belong to a goy. Beperot Israel asurin Right? So he says, when it comes to the fruits of the Jew, he says they're forbidden to everybody. Why? The muktzin because they're muktzah. Why they're muktzah? The whole shen mechutz tchum ikatzum la'balim midatan. Because since they're outside the boundary, the owner does not think of using it. The shel Yisrael tzarchin hachen, right? So therefore, right, if they belong to a Jew, they need to be designated for that. About shel goy, if it belongs to a goy and tzarich hachen, so then it doesn't need designation. That's what he says. Interesting. Okay. Then he goes on. Katav od. So it says furthermore, the Rashba. Sha'alta im samchinan al balai tur. So he says, right, you asked me, right? Some guy asked him this question, right? Do we rely on the balai tur, right? One rabbi. The goy shevi doron Yisrael, regarding a goy that brought a gift for a Jew. That in the case like this, we say, right, it's even allowed to the one that it was brought for. Within 4 amot. So he answers, right, Teshuvah, nireli de lo shehu samech ala Yerushalmi. So he says, seems like not. Why? Because he relied on Yerushalmi, he says, Shamar kablinun veochlinun go mugrion nidach. Ve'ilu begimra rapapa satam amar. So he says, right, that this leniency that they made over here was only according to Yerushalmi. But he says in our Gemara, right, in the Bavli, not so. Stam amar. So what does that mean, stam amar? He didn't differentiate between this and that. So what does that mean? That what he means to say is that the Gemara said over there, right, that didn't differentiate whether it was brought between the person that it was brought for or somebody else. Let me just make sure if we got this right here. Right. So in other words, the question was like this, right? Again, to reiterate. The question to the Rashba was, are we allowed to use this kind of item that was brought for a Jew, even for the person that it was brought for? But he says, right, that this rabbi holds that it's allowed to use it within arba amot, within 4 amot. What does that mean? You get the point here? It means that you can use it, but like don't move it too far. That's what this rabbi says, you know? Outside of 4 amot, you cannot move it. So Rashba says, no, sorry. So why is that? Because he says that's relying on the Yerushalmi that says this, you know? But in the Bavli, right, in our Gemara, it doesn't say that. So therefore, right, the Rashba says that we have to be stringent about that. So again, right, to reiterate, what are we talking about here? We're talking about a case where the goy brought for the Jew, right, an item that was coming outside of the boundary, and it's something which is not attached to the ground. So there, right, the rule is for the Jew that it was brought, it's forbidden. For other Jews, it's permitted, right? And that's the way we paskin, you know, that's it, right? We don't go any more lenient than that. That's what he's saying. Whether it's within 4 amot or outside the 4 amot, doesn't really matter. It's all the same. Okay, good. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch here. Hey, now we're gonna recap everything, right? To get everything straightened out. I want you guys to understand, by the way, this is the advantage of learning, this method, Tur Bet Yosef Shulchan Aruch. The advantage is, that basically you learn the topic matter from beginning to end, So you're not really missing anything here. So you understand all the opinions, all the sides, and everything, This way you really got the whole story. Not so when you try to do this yourself, right? To be a hero, and start from the Gemara, and then read the Rishonim and try to formulate the halacha yourself, which is very difficult. You know what I mean? We're not on that level to do things like this. So therefore, we need the Bet Yosef. Whoever thinks he doesn't need it, he's in for a surprise. So this is the best methodology of learning, halacha, right? Step by step, from the Gemara and the Rishonim, halacha, Shulchan Aruch, right? The whole thing, top to bottom. Nothing beats this. So that's why all the big poskim, they all learned Bet Yosef all their lives, from day one to day, right, to the last day. That's what they did. There's a story brought down in the book called Shevet Halevi, right, which is Rav Wazner. He was a big posek, in Bnei Brak, right? So he writes in his book Shevet Halevi. So he says, right, that the Chazon Ish, who was the big rabbi there, in the former generation, before, right, before our generation. He passed away already, like in the, I think it was like in the 50s, like somewhere around there, long time ago. So before most of us were born. So something like that, right? So anyway, right, he says about the Chazon Ish, that he started, when he was 18 years old, he started to learn Bet Yosef, so all the other rabbis there, in Bnei Brak, these Ashkenazi rabbis, they were all making fun of him, you know what I mean? Like, what is he doing? Like learning Bet Yosef. What's going to come out of this guy? You know what I mean? Like, what's going to be the end? So they used to say about him, he's probably going to be like a school teacher, something like that. So it's a really funny thing. So what happened in the end, right? Says the Shevet Halevi, Rav Wazner. He says that because he learned Bet Yosef, he became the posek of the whole, of the whole town, and these people, who are making fun of him, now are coming to him to ask him questions in halacha. That's what happened. So that's what it is, basically, right? If you start learning Bet Yosef at a nice young age, you will become the posek of your town. Just like the Chazon Ish, it's the same thing, right? So, but if you don't do that, you'll never be a posek, right? You cannot paskin halacha without Bet Yosef. Forget about it, right? It's a done deal. So that's the important thing, That's By the way, you ever notice like nobody does this kind of learning, like in America, and it's very rare. Only like some small kollels, whatever, here and there, right? Some Sephardi kollels. But it's not something which is generally taught, especially on the internet, and this kind of thing. We're the only game in town, I mean, nobody else does this.
I was just talking about that yesterday with someone. This kind of learning is not.
I mean, we're the only game in town. I'm the only one who teaches this on the internet. There's nobody else. So if you want to get in on it, whatever, right? You'll gain a lot from that. Because the rabbis tell us, if you learn Bet Yosef, you will learn how to paskin halacha. It'll teach you how to paskin. And otherwise, nobody will teach you. Who's going to teach you? That's the way it is, So you have to understand that it's a big zechut, it's a big privilege to learn this methodology, right, that we're doing here. Okay, but, so we should know that. So we're getting now, almost to like our 400th class in this, in this learning, this, right? We're almost up to 400. So not too bad, Baruch Hashem. We should see another 400, right? And more and more and more, right? Because this way, it'll stay on the internet, and anybody who wants to listen to it can listen to it. So it's a good thing, All right. So anyway, right, let's go to Shulchan Aruch. Right, so here it says Shulchan Aruch, davar she'en b'mino b'mechubar. So as we said, right, something which is not attached to the ground, right? Like we brought an example. What was it? Cheese, right? Something like that, right? Veno mechusar tzedar. It's also not lacking any trapping, right? For instance, let's say, right, you send him a goat, right? A goat doesn't need to be trapped. He's already in your house, right? In your backyard there, right? Whatever, right? So there's not much you need to do with this guy. Yeah. We're not talking about those wild mountain goats, right? We're not talking about those guys. We're talking about, your domesticated goat, right? Okay. So, right, the thing is like this, right? So it says regarding that, right? So if it came from within the boundary, as we said, right? We defined what that is now. We know, right? Brooklyn, Queens, right? Oh, we know those things. So there, right? If it came from within the boundary, it's allowed for everybody, right? All men are created equal, right? When it comes to this, right? And also the women, obviously, right? Oh, of course. Don't get me into trouble now. So, right, now, here's the thing, right? Ve'im bao michutz letchum. So I said, what about if it came from outside the boundary? Right? Asur leochlan lemי שהובאו בשבילו. So there, it's going to be forbidden for the person that it was brought for, right? That guy. Ulechol bnei beto. And also he says, oh, interesting, right? He says also his whole family. So the whole family is like one group. We didn't see this in the Bet Yosef. Interesting, right? We didn't see that. Anyway, אבל מותר לטלטלן מתוך ד' אמות. Oh, look what it says, right? But you're allowed to carry it within 4 amot. או בתוך העיר, right? Also within the town, מוקפת חומה, which is surrounded by a walled city, right? Basically. או מבצר שידוע שהוקף לדירה. Also, if you have like a מבצר, you know what that is? Like a fort, right? Something like that, right? That was surrounded for dwelling purposes. Right? ואחרים מותרים אף לאוכלם. But he says other people, right, can even eat this stuff. So what we just said now only applies to the person that it was brought for, right, and his immediate family, right, as we said, right? But when it comes to others, they can have it right away. So we said, right, what's the reason why? Because we said the rabbis were not so stringent when it comes to boundaries because it's only rabbinical. That's the reason why. So then he goes on to say, ולערב צריך להמתין מי שהובאו בשבילו. But it says you also have to wait, right? After the Yom Tov goes out, the time that it takes to do the labor, right? But Kadesh Yasu, you gotta wait that time. So, in other words, we're lenient in the sense that we don't make you wait till the end of the second day or the end of Shabbat, right? As we said before, regarding things which are attached. Here, We just tell you, wait till the end of this day, right? And then wait till time that it takes to do the labor, and then you can go for it, right? Take it as it is. No problem. Okay, good. So it says the Ramah here, מותרים אחר כך אפילו לדידן שנוהגים להחמיר בשאר דברים כמו שנתבהר. So he says, right, look at the Ramah says here, right? So he says, even we, right, Ashkenazim, who are, we already mentioned, right, yesterday, that their custom is more stringent regarding this issue. Why is that? Because they go like Rabbeinu Tam, right? Who makes you wait until the end of the second day. But he says here, regarding this issue, even we're not stringent, he says, right? So in other words, do like the Shulchan Aruch, right? Don't budge from there. So in other words, they're telling you, right, this time you can be a Sephardi guy, if you're Ashkenazi, right? No problem. With this halakha, no problem. Okay, very good. That's the Shulchan Aruch. So let's see what else we got here. I guess we can maybe knock off one other one, right? One more. We'll knock it off. Okay, let's see. So yeah, he says here, כתוב בתשובת הגאונים, it says in the תשובה בגאונים, אפילו בקורטובה, ששם מקום מלכות, right? בגויים מרובים. So he says, right? This town, right? Cordoba, which is like in Spain, right? Cordova. You know that, right? Okay. Cordova.
Yes.
And so he says, even Cordova. So what's the how is that unique? So he says there's a government there, right? Malchut, there's government, and there's lots of goyim there, right? Plenty of Catholic guys over there, right? No lacking, right? So it says, nevertheless, right? And there's not many Jews there, right? It seems like Cordova was not a big Jewish community, whatever, right? At that time, anyway, whatever, right? So it says, but there's concern that they're bringing extra, bishvil Israel for the Jews, asur, then it's going to be forbidden. So what is he telling you here, right? Let me explain to you the point. He's saying that, we already discussed this, by the way, I think yesterday, right? That it really depends on also, right? In other words, if the goy is bringing certain merchandise into a town, so the rule is, how do we determine if he bought it for the Jews or he bought it for the goyim, If we don't know, if we're not really sure. So we go according to the majority of the town, right? That's what he's saying, right? So in other words, in Cordova, for sure, the majority is non-Jewish, right? So therefore, right, we assume that it was brought for the goyim, this merchandise that they brought, the goyim. That's the assumption. Unless, he says, what? If we notice that they're bringing more merchandise to sell to the Jews, right? If we get that, we get those vibes, if you know what I mean, right? You can see what's going on there, right? So then, right, we gotta forbid that, because now it's being bought for the Jews. It's a different story altogether, right? He brings a Gemara, right, to support this in Eruvin Mem Amud Aleph. It says in Orchot Chaim, Katuv b'Shem Arashba. So his name, right, it says the Rashba, Kvar Bianu, says we already explained, Shemukse Midivrei Sofrim. So he says the prohibition of mukse is rabbinical. You knew that, right? Of course, you knew, right? Everybody knows that. I hope you know. Right? It's not from the Torah. So he says, therefore, when it comes to doubt, we go lenient, right? The rule is, right? In rabbinical matters, we go lenient. That's the way it goes. So therefore, the rule is like this, right? If they bought it from the goyim, for the goyim, or right, or the majority is goyim over there, right? So we assume that it was bought for the goyim. Mutar, it's allowed to use that stuff. Shekola mevi, letzorech harov mevi. Why? Because when a person brings something to a town, he brings it for the majority. That's what we assume, right? The majority. That's what he's saying. Okay, good. So let's see the Shulchan Aruch and we're done, right? Let's go. Right, so says Shulchan Aruch, Vav, right? Be'ir sheruba enam Yehudim. So it says, in a town where the majority is not Jewish, okay? Minastam kol mevi letzorech harov mevi. So we assume, right, when he brings something, he's bringing it for the majority, right? So okay, that's clear, right? And says the Ramah here, he adds mechza mechza. What about 50-50, right? It's like 50-50 town, you know? So it says, oh, shiadua sheloket letzorech shnehem. Let's say we know, right, he's doing for both of them. So then he says, right, it's forbidden. So if you have like, 50-50 situation, it says the Ramah, it's forbidden, right? That's pretty clear. So, but, now don't get carried away what I told you. Why? Because the truth is, right, that there are still rules about something which was brought for Jews and Goyim. But here, right, what are we talking about? Right? We're continuing this theme that we started, which was that we're talking here about something which is not attached to the ground, right? But it could be that he brought it from outside the boundary. So there, right, there were some limitations, as we said, right? Depends on which Jew, right? But here, since he brought it into a town which is majority Goyim, and we have no information that he brought it for Jews. So we assume, right, that they brought it for Goyim, and therefore the Jews can use this, right, even though it's brought from outside the boundary. That's what we're saying. Okay, very good. I guess we'll stop there, Bezat Hashem, and we'll continue next time. Thanks for coming. Be blessed with wealth and health and happiness. We'll see you tomorrow. Laila Tov, Chazak Baruch. God bless.
Thank you.
All the best.
Thank you, Rabbi.
God bless.